Hi, I'm Tala from Divine Heretic Astrology at divineheretic.org. And today we are going to look at the mythology and the asteroid, because of course there is one, of Iphigenia. And this is something I like to call learned helplessness. Or also, I was kind of toying with the alternate title that was basically about justification. When people are like, well, there's nothing I could do. And, usually we find when people say this to us, and when we say this to ourselves, when we look back on these instances later on, there actually is, a few things that we can do. The outcome may still be the same, but, there's always something rather than leaving all of this kind of up, to fate. And I want to start off here with a quote. Speaking of learned helplessness from Carl Jung, he says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, which is a really important quote. There's a lot in Gnostic scripture about uh, how fate is basically this thing that is dictated as part of, the simulation that we're in, the Black Iron Prison, according to Philip K. Dick, right? But there's also this way, there's obviously a very big degree of difference between kind of this elevated, version of fate. There's a lot of wiggle room. So in astrological placements, for example, if you have your Venus that's weak, uh, are you going to marry your high school sweetheart and, move to the suburbs, have 2.5 children? Like, probably not. You probably have other things in your chart that need to be done. But does that mean you're going to be this, this justification for having no love and being super bitter about it? No, there's always like a lot of room and like a lot of influence. And I want to kind of push these limits of traditional astrology when I talk about Gnostic astrology, because we do have a lot of serenity and we do have a lot of power. And that's something that kind of is referred to over and over in these Gnostic texts, and bringing this back to this power within ourselves rather than being in these master-slave relationships of fathers and cops and principals and government officials, like this is an artificial system ruled by Saturn. I would say, even as helpful as it is for this life, the zodiac is as well, right? And it has its rules, and the easier, we kind of look at these rules, what we can do, the easier our lives tend to flow. But that doesn't mean that we're not kind of in this odd simulation. So let's look at Iphigenia to kind of see how we're trapped here in this learned helplessness. Now, who is she? She is the eldest daughter of King Agamemnon. And basically, he's in this big battle, and he takes a little time off. Like all the presidents like to go golfing. Well, he goes hunting and he kills one of Artemis's stags. She's the Roman Diana, goddess of hunting, and this deer was very important to her. And we all know how the elites like their blood sacrifices. So basically, she goes to him and says, she's very angry, and she says, in exchange for you killing one of my precious deer, I want you to sacrifice your eldest daughter, or I will hold back the winds, and your allies won't be able to come to Troy to assist you in this battle. And he really hesitates, but his commanders basically like peer pressure him into it. And so, Ovid even says, he says, a virgin blood must satisfy the virgin goddess's anger. The common cause was stronger than affection. The king subdued the father. Agamemnon led Iphigenia to the solemn altar, and she stood there ready for the offering of her chaste blood. Even the priests were weeping. So you can see in these pictures of her, she's being carried here forcefully by the king's henchman, basically, and he refuses to look her in the eye. And she's trying to get his attention. And she's helpless, right? And in this mythology, in the common mythology, there's nothing that she can do. Now, there is an alternate ending where she escapes and goes to her brother and goes and visits him. He's in some distant land. But in the main version of the story, we hear most regularly she is sacrificed. And of course, it's tragic because, she can't struggle, she can't do anything. So I want to kind of point out here that there's a couple of things here. First off, this picture I found of her is, supposedly they lured her to this battle site by saying that she was going to marry this really handsome warrior. So I found this picture, and to me, this picture, she's like on her iPhone. That's what it looks like, and she's like, "OMG, LOL, I'm getting married today." But yes, okay, so obviously that does not happen. Anyways, this happens, and this is kind of important where I'm getting at here. This happens at a place called Aulis, Aulis. And this is really important because an all is a Hebrew word, uh, and it comes, the word our word all, AWL, comes from this. It's just a pointed instrument for making holes. And according to these Hebrew servitude rules, let me just read you some of them here. Exodus 21:6. Then his master shall bring him unto the judges, he shall also bring him to the door, or onto the door post, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. And when I read these Bible verses, I always feel like I should be talking like Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction, but I'm just not that good at it. Deuteronomy 15:17. Then thou shalt take an awl and thrust it through his ear unto the door, and he shall be thy servant forever. The lovely folks at Bible Hub uh, say here. And I just want to preface this by saying I have a friend who uses this word yarf, which is a combination of barf and yuck, and so it'd be very applicable here. The piercing of the awl was a public declaration of a servant's loyalty and commitment to his master, signifying a lifelong bond. This act was not merely a physical marking, but a profound statement of love and dedication, both to the master and to the household. There's the master-slave again, right? Master-slave relationship. So this is not necessarily true. Like when we look at, you know, ears and earrings, okay? First off, it's like a cattle tag, when you see them, they're pierced through the ear. So the olive, the fact that she's in this place, it's like this is where they get you by the proverbial balls, the archons or this archonic influence, or with the help of yourself being kind of committed to this. Like you think you can't escape from here. This is back to the same tarot card I always talk about where, the bonds are loosened, like you could escape if you need to, because we are sovereign. We do have this power, right? And in many countries during this time, in Persia and India, the ears of boys were regularly pierced in servitude to the gods. And there's a lot of references in text to the opening of the ear, which means removing yourselves from this servitude. Now, there's a very Saturnian influence with earrings. When you think of wedding rings and you think of the bands and you think of, Saturn limits, right? It imposes restrictions. So when you're taking this wedding ring on, you're like, I'm going to be loyal to this one person. It's restrictive on your finger. The same thing with a priest's collar. And just take a look here of all the corporations that use Saturn in their logos. It's pretty mind-blowing, right? We are in this system that is really, really restrictive. So, but like I said, we have a lot of wiggle room, right? How do we make it to the alternate ending of Iphigenia? The one where she gets to do what she wants. So this placement is, like I said, it's not like an addiction. But it's when I tell people where their placement is and what house, they usually go, "Oh, this is where you want to really do some deep work." Besides just the obvious work of like, what are you kind of, materially, connected to, and it's hard for you to give up. But this is more like on a really deep level of why do I keep wanting to step into this karmic cycle? Do I need to keep doing this? Maybe I do. Maybe I kind of need to keep reincarnating. But there's a big difference between karma and fate. And, I think a lot of people get to the point where they're like, why do I need, to reincarnate and go back and learn these lessons over and over again? Like, I'm done here. Like, what is the actual purpose? Here's a little meme that I really like, and I always think about this when I talk about this. So, where is this? How does this pertain to you? Now, here's a little kind of refresher here. When I do people's charts, I'm really big on teaching them how to do a chart. I use Astrodience. I recommend it to people. It's astro.com because it's free for one thing. What you're going to do here is you're going to go and scroll here in astro.com. A little aside here, and it goes to chart under house selection, house system. You want to pick whole signs. Chris Brandon from the Astrology podcast is really the best at defending this, but I use it for all natal. I use different techniques. I use different house systems for orrery and medical, but that's whole sign not only is it easiest, it has so much evidence of being used in some of the earliest horoscope being cast. So what we're going to do here is here's my example. All right, go through here to you get to additional objects, asteroid name and number list. We're going to select I. We're going to scroll down. Iphigenia, she's what is she? 112 here, and then you're going to click on display the chart and show the chart, and then poof, you're going to have your chart. Here's mine for the Saturn Neptune conjunction. Interesting that Iphigenia is in the 12th house for that. Quick uh refresher of the houses. What does this or any planet, really any placement in a house mean? Really quickly. First house is the house of self, second house is the house of finance and assets, third house is the house of communication, also your neighborhood, short distances. Fourth house is the house of family, it's the foundation, it's the traditions. Fifth house is the house of pleasure, children, gambling, romance, art, all fifth house pleasures. Sixth house is the house of illness, of small pets, of service. Seventh house is the house of relationships, all kinds of relationships. Eighth house is the house of death, transformation, and other people's money. Ninth house is the house of travel, both internal and external, like with the mind and physical body, and also higher learning institutions. 10th house is your peak. For most people, this is their career, but not always necessarily so. 11th house is the house of social organizations, groups, meetings. And the 12th house is hidden to the native. It is the house of the metaphysical. It's a portal. It's also the house of insanity, addiction, and exile. So we're going to look at this kind of a thing to be aware of. I'm going to give you some tips here, like I hinted at in the introduction to this video. And this is for really with any sixth house, eighth house, or 12th house placements. These houses are considered to be kind of the gnarlier houses. They're not, when you look at the 12th house of, insanity and addiction, and then the eighth house of this of death and transformation, and the sixth house of illness, right? They're considered houses where if there's planets here. Again, a lot of wiggle room, right? But there's usually some kind of ominous thing that needs to be transcended in these houses. So I'm going to kind of give you some special tips for dealing with these houses for Iphigenia, but also for planets. So if she is in the first house, this is like the fear of the body and really kind of removing the mind from the mind-body equation. Like when people get sick, I had a great doctor who always said there is a psychological component to every illness, and that's completely true. So that's Iphigenia in the first house. Really, you want to make that connection with your body. Like, why do you fear your body? Why are you battling a cold or fighting a virus? Or, like, why are we doing battle with your body? Your body wants to help you. If it has inflammation, it's because, like, all the cells in your body are like, we want to live. They're on your side, right? So instead of making it this battleground, to really kind of understand that everything your body is doing if you have high blood pressure, for example, your body is doing this for a reason to compensate for whatever the root cause of your illness is. So kind of really looking at your body through that lens should be helpful if you have Iphigenia here. The second house, when people have this in the second house, they have these worries of financial situations, like how will I survive? What's going to happen if there's this collapse? And you really kind of want to lean into this idea of like, there's nothing that I can do in this, event, or events that happen, I just need to kind of be in the moment and be present with it, not let this fear, financial fear, and money in general is like this really big spell casting. And there's a great book called The Soul of Money, I think it's called. And that would be, I would, if I had the second house Iphigenia, I would read that book. I might do a whole segment on this book because it's money in the way that we have enslaved ourselves here in the future. Third house, determined to be correct. This is that feeling that in Buddhism, when they say it feels really good to be self-righteous, right? To think that you're right. And being like, awake on whatever level you want to consider is, when you try to force your viewpoints on other people, you can drop little hints and seeds of things that, you might find helpful to be in service because we are, connected to a degree of this collective unconsciousness of humanity. But, when you say really harsh things to people and they kind of recoil, it's because they're not ready and they need, for whatever reason, to make decisions, about their body serenity, about their body or what they believe or their belief systems. And, you can't push them too much. There's like that saying that says the tender young shoots of bamboo are not meant for the harsh rays of the noontime sun. I think about that a lot. But just not pushing your viewpoint, not being really attached. And, of course, our opinions on things sometimes change as well, right? As we develop further gnosis on them. Fourth house is family traditions, but also I'm going to put superstitions here and ancestral trauma. Examples would be like Catholic block or, this is the way we've always done things, or, I do this, because my father does it this way, or, you know, sometimes you might need to disconnect from some of these things. It might necessarily uh, be the best for you. Fifth house. This is kind of like, can be kind of superficial where you need to really be appreciated for your art. And, to get a little deeper into this, Rick Rubin, for example, the producer, we all know he's a dark sorcerer and practicer of, of magic, but he's revealing occult truth, which they have to do, and he always talks about you shouldn't make art for the audience, you should make art for yourself. And there's this kind of trust that you need to have where just by making it, you're putting it in the record. Even when mainstream scientists talk about the earth, they talk about, oh, it's kind of crazy how earth seems to have this memory. And to the mystics, right, we call it the Akashic or the Akashic records. And it's just a record of everything that's ever been done. So, this idea that you're putting this output that you need to do into the Akashic, whether or not you receive acknowledgement for it in this lifetime is one thing. But one of my favorite writers and scientists, this guy Rupert Sheldrake, talks a lot about this. He talks about, crossword puzzles, for example, or when you do the New York Times crossword, more people solve it later on in the day. And that goes against what we think about the brain and memory, because you would think, usually your brain gets saturated and at a certain point at the end of the day, you're like, okay, I can't take on anything else. I have no more bandwidth for this. But um, what he found in some of his research, and you can like look this up, he talks about when they would give mice, like say in Tokyo, a maze, and the mice would solve it, or rats, sorry, they'd give rats this maze, and then the next day you give a rat, in Iowa, the same exact maze. So they would find that the rats would solve the maze a microsecond quicker. And then the next day you give it to a rat in Mexico, the same maze, and they're going to solve it a tiny amount quicker still. So this idea that you're putting this into the Akashic, and that's how we access, this certain information. And in this Kali Yuga, we have a hard time doing this, but it's still there. So I think that's really important to kind of recognize that whatever art you're doing, that, don't get too attached to being, like, look, I bled my heart out for you and I made this for you, and no one appreciates it. But it's going in the Akashic and it's necessary, kind of this trust for whatever reason. And this is also why we want to say too that when people like are waking up, like when they go from like, oh, like people go from like 9/11 was an inside job to like spiritual, like, kind of like questioning spiritual reality really quickly. I think that's because more people are putting this information in the Akashic. So, you can go from conspiracy theorist, or you can go from normie to conspiracy theorist really quickly in today's world, right? Which is great because all conspiracy theory leads to spirituality. Sixth house, Iphigenia. Suffering. This is kind of linked to, there's like an Egyptian creation myth that talks about this, and Jung talks about this a lot with the book, his response to the Book of Job. And there's a lot of people that when you talk about this kind of prison planet theory, they say that, well, suffering is like not necessary. And but I don't think, again, suffering and karma are the same thing. Like I know that for a lot of people, suffering brings people to these revelations they would not normally have had. So there's that there. Uh, you can walk out of the karma cycle. Maybe the suffering brings you to that point. But really kind of questioning, right? Here's my sixth house pro tip here, advice. When I was really sick from a tick bite, I had someone who actually read my Akashic records tell me, because I was really sick and I worried that I was going to die and I have a kid and blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. And she told me to do this meditation where you basically sit and you meditate on, like, am I going to die? Is this, and you'll come to the right answer, because there's a really big mystic thing about, we all kind of have some idea, I think, when we're going to die. And there is like a really famous story that what's her name? J.K. Rowling took from Harry Potter about the three brothers, and they have this cloak. And, the first brother takes this cloak and hides from the Reaper. And then the second brother, I can't remember the whole story, but I think he like disguises himself so he like can, go behind like this rock and the Reaper doesn't see him. But the third brother basically decides to meet the Reaper where he's at, and he takes off the cape, and the Reaper and him walk off like hand in hand as mutual friends, not as, again, this master slave relationship. And in traditional astrology, there is a technique to look for death in the charts. It does just show you the breaks energetically where this potentially could happen. But doing a meditation when you're really kind of at that edge, of suffering, am I going to die from this? If the answer is yes, then, accordingly, you're going to prepare yourself mentally what you need to do. But for most of the time, the answer is going to be no. And it's a kind of a big step in, giving yourself back control. So that's my, it's a very deep meditation, but there it is if you want to try it. Seventh house, leaving the relationships behind, these people aren't good for me, basically. A lot of times people have the Virginia in the seventh house. I'm not saying get rid of everybody, but you do want to individualize, and you do want to kind of recognize, a lot of us have people in our lives that maybe you shouldn't be there, and where they're out of necessity or niceness, or just to be polite. But if you have it in the seventh, there's probably a relationship in there that was really toxic for you, and it's preventing you from kind of moving forward. So I would look at that. Iphigenia in the eighth, people have it here. They're already on it. Let's say with these eighth house placements, like they know exactly where to dig and what rabbit holes to go down, and it's just necessary for them to explore here. And it might be hard for their friends or partners to understand why they're going so deep and so dark all the time, but they just got to get to the bottom of the rabbit hole. So even though the eighth house can be what they consider this gnarly house, I hesitate to say anything is good or bad because it's so dualistic. I would say it's necessary. So if you have it here in the eighth house, you're probably already digging. In fact, you're probably the most uh, at ease with this with this placement, I would say. If Virginia in the ninth house, it becomes kind of hard here because it's this idea of freedom, this concept, the Gnostic concept that we're these light beings, but we're trapped in these containers. We can't get out. People like to think I'm free and I can do whatever I want. And that's why the idea of the black iron prison or the simulation theory really freaks people out so much because it's kind of removing that freedom. And, when you look at it, when you look at the whole system, and when people like have this kind of awakening where they're like, why am I paying taxes? Why am I watching this TV show? Who decided to make this TV show? What are they telling? What do they want me to believe? What is even real? It's the whole Orwellian idea of like only believe what, I'll find the exact quote, but it's like you can only really believe what you see with your own two eyes. And everything else, I mean, there's a reason why television is called programming, right? Do we know people will defend things that they've heard on television or I just was listening to someone talk about overpopulation and how they didn't want to have kids because it was a bad thing. And I'm like, but that's from this whole very colonialistic idea. I can't remember the guy's name, but he basically was going to Africa and like convincing everybody that, the poor people, it's their fault, basically, and, they shouldn't reproduce. So that whole idea, when we kind of parrot that statement, it's been kind of drilled into our heads because, the parasitic elite, of course, wanted all these mineral-rich countries. And so they constantly hear like, poor people are so stupid. It's very racist as well, usually. They're so stupid that they just keep having children. And that people just say this all the time, and like, how do we really know this? People have done lots of scientists have done models that show there's more than enough arable land for everybody. So, ninth house freedom. 10th house, career compromise. And this is, I feel like, one of the easier ones to resolve as well. Like, I hate this, but I do it for the bills. Okay. Like, how much do you hate it? You know? Do you hate it so much that, like you just dread going to work and it's making you physically ill? Or can you tolerate it? Are you working 70 hours a week, and you never see your family? And then one day you wake up and you're 65 and, you're like, great, I'm retiring. Oh, and I have this heart condition. I'm going to die in a few years. How much do you hate this? 11th house is this leaving the pack and rejecting this tribalism. And when you think about it, we naturally gravitate towards people who are similar and have similar likes and dislikes, is how it's always been. But now we have this, this two-party political system is where you see it, where people, the elites are aware that we are tribalistic. We are animals that like to be in a pack. And they're aware of this, so they pit us against each other. So the 11th house of Virginia, it's like when your uncle, who voted for whoever he voted for, it's kind of comes to the conclusion, he's like, oh, I've been looking at the Epstein files, and I think all of them are corrupt. That's a good rejection of the 11th house social groups. 12th house. Again, here's my pro-life tip for the 12th house. Iphigenia, if you have it in your 12th house, it's to do with past lives. It's because it's hidden from you. And a little story here I kind of talk about. I don't, maybe I won't go too deeply into this, but a lot of kids have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and that's not. There's another version where it's like where you're just anal, but I mean OCD, which is kind of this irrational. People know it's irrational, but they're still compelled to do these compulsive things. Like Howard Hughes famously had it, people who wash their hands a lot. I had it really bad as a child, and it's common as a child. It's this version of magical thinking. If I get off the bus from like the back door or the front door, if I get off the bus from the back door, will something bad happen? And in the back of our mind, when we have this, we know that we're not being logical. And I think that's the difference between OCD and say like schizophrenia. I think OCD and phobias, when people have these phobias of snakes, um, this is a past life experience. Whereas, people with OCD know that what they're thinking is irrational, as opposed to schizophrenia, which, I can't remember his name now, but he's been at Rikers for, a couple decades, and he just sees this pattern of mental illness and schizophrenia where he's convinced it's spirit possession. I think there's probably something there. But OCD is not that. It's this kind of partially submerged, I guess, artifact of a past life. And I would argue that all phobias are. If you have this 12th house placement, you really kind of want to think about uh and kind of maybe delve into like why do I have these fears? Because that's what I would say in the 12th house is kind of where you need to kind of dig and figure out, really confront these fears in a way where you can kind of bring these past life memories back up because that's what they are. And it's just important in conclusion here to remember that, again, we might be comfortable staying here. I was just listening to David Block, who I love his lectures, and he's talking about in this very Gnostic way, he's talking about, I'm preparing and getting these things set up for my next lifetime here. So, where I'm more like, I don't know, I kind of want to break this karmic cycle. So it's not like one is better than the other. It's just like your friend who doesn't want to look at, maybe the Epstein files as being a reality or, what look at past lives even being like a real thing or anything really. Or if people don't believe in astrology, like they're just not ready for it. It doesn't make you better than them. You're just at a different point, and time most likely outside of this lifetime is not linear. So, we're just, we see it this way, but when we look at the ancient Egyptian cycles, they had a very different version of time, which is why sometimes you had kings that it appeared that the kings were their own fathers because they have these different cycles that overlapped. And, most likely time, we experience it in these bodies, but it's most likely very different than this linear thing that goes from point A to point B. So again, it's just, where you are, and also just, we are connected, even though we are individual. We need to individualize and recognize what is best for us, but we are connected to humanity in this way, and I always love to think of that Ram Dass quote where he says we are all just walking each other home. So the more knowledge we put in the Akashic, and the more we kind of recognize and look at the myth of Iphigenia, we can see where we need to really look at and how attached we are to our outcome and if we even should be that attached in the first place. Thanks for listening.